Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Since it is now December, it is time for my usual monthly wrap-up. Side note, I'm thinking about kind of changing these videos next year to doing more of like a monthly favorites rather than a monthly wrap-up, because I kind of want to talk about like movies that I've seen and TV that I'm into and stuff like that. Let me know if that sounds interesting to you. But let's just get right into the wrap-up for now. I only read 4 books this past month in November because it was just kind of a busy month. Also, 3 of those were audiobooks. So let's get started. So the first of the books that I read in November was I Am Malala, which is by Malala Yousafzai. It was for the Pop Sugar category of a political memoir. And Malala Yousafzai is the teenage girl who was working as an activist for a girls' education in Pakistan and was eventually shot by the Taliban for it. And she survived and was taken to a hospital in the UK, and I believe she still lives there now. But this book was really interesting in that I didn't really know a lot of history about the area, which was the Valley of Swat, I think it was pronounced, in Pakistan, which is an area that borders Afghanistan. And I learned a lot about the history of the area. I learned a lot about the Pashtun people that she belongs to, and I learned a lot about the history of Swat, and I learned a lot about the rise of the Taliban in Pakistan, which I just didn't really know because that's not a thing that's really taught very well in American schools. So it was a really fascinating read. Malala is a driven but also really kind person, and also it was just really fascinating to see someone working to better her country through the rise of fanaticism and dictatorships, so I actually really enjoyed this book, and you know, I would recommend it. The audiobook is read by Archie Punjabi, who I believe was also in The Good Wife, which was a TV show that I was super into for a little while, and it was read really well, and I enjoyed the audiobook because it helped me learn how the things were pronounced, which if I had just been reading it written out, I probably would not have really gotten. So I really enjoyed that also. So the next book that I read this past month was the only book that I have a physical copy of. I finally finished Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This was written, I think, in the 1920s or 1930s? 1938, apparently. And so I read this for the Pop Sugar category of Read a 20th Century Classic, and also I've just been kind of wanting to read more Gothics lately. I really enjoyed this. It was so fascinating, and there's a lot that I could say about it, particularly about the fact that Rebecca is one of the most interesting characters, even though she's dead the whole book. This is not a spoiler, we find this out like immediately. And it is so fascinating watching the mindset of the main character, Mrs. De Winter, who sadly we never get a first name for, but her mindset is so fascinating because she clearly knows that something is wrong, but she's also clearly trying to convince herself that everything's fine. And this ends up coming out in ways where her anxiety gets really intense because she's pretending that everything's fine really hard, and so it'll be things like they'll be having a tea party and she's just completely wrapped up in the fact that she might be serving the tea wrong because she's completely unused to this society. Anyway, I'm realizing I have not actually told you the plot of Rebecca, which is about the young narrator who is unnamed meeting Mr. De Winter, who is this prominent figure. He owns Manderley, which is this beautiful house that she's known about for a long time and is really admired, and his previous wife had died about a year ago, and they meet while on holiday in Monte Carlo. She's basically working as a personal assistant for a woman that she hates, who is just like really capricious and selfish, and she ends up getting sort of seduced by Mr. De Winter, and he is really like dismissive of her, but she's just so lonely and so desperate for a better life that when he proposes to her, she says yes. And there's so many hints in here that she knows that this was a bad idea and she knows that there's something wrong in this house, but she's just kind of trying to pretend that everything's fine. So this was a really fascinating book. It's a little slow because that's kind of how Gothics work. It's just this sort of slow creeping horror that eventually unfolds. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. So the next book that I finished in November is one that was for the Pop Sugar category of Read a book written by a comedian. I decided to read Buffering for this one. It is by Hannah Hart, who I count as a comedian. She's a YouTube comedian, but I think that that's fair enough. And the subtitle, I think, is like Unshared Tales of a Life Fully Loaded, I think. So while this book is funny in parts, I would not say that overall it is particularly humorous, because it talks about her experience growing up between 2 households where her mother is bipolar, but also I believe has some form of schizophrenia, so she was having a lot of delusions, and so is entirely messy and the house is like uninhabitable, but everything is shared and everyone is kind of loving and open with each other, but she also has these like manic delusions. And then her father's house, who is completely clean, like obsessively clean, but also like they're Jehovah's Witnesses, and so she knows that because she's gay, if she comes out, like they think that she's going to hell. So there are some parts of this book that are difficult to read, like reading about her mother's disorder is really hard because it takes a really long time for her mother to get help, and that's one of the things that she's talking about, is how hard it is to get adults help when they don't want it. But I thought that it was a really interesting story, and it was really lovely seeing how she was able to grow up and heal and become the person that she is today. So while it is difficult to read in parts, I still think that it is worth reading. So the final book that I'm going to talk about this month is also kind of on the theme of mental illness, which is Challenger Deep by Neil Shusterman. I read this book for the category of Read a National Book Award winner. I also did this one on audiobook, and it was so moving. I am just kind of blown away by it. It is about a kid who is suffering from some kind of delusional mental illness. We're not totally sure what it is. He never gets this like really clear diagnosis. So the book is kind of split for a while between two plot lines. There's like his life at school and with his family and their vacations and all of that kind of stuff. And then there's a whole separate narrative about Caden Bosch, who is the main character, on this pirate ship where there's this captain and there's like a parrot that has an eye patch, but the parrot talks. And to me, it became very clear very quickly what was happening in the story. I'm not totally sure that I was supposed to get it that soon, but it does become to me very clear that the pirate ship is his own delusional experience of being in a psychiatric facility. So again, this is another book that is kind of difficult to read because it's dealing with very serious mental illness, but it was so beautifully written. Like, Caden's narration is at times really sad, and sometimes it's manic, but sometimes it's so compassionate, and sometimes he is just really smart and really funny, and when he's more lucid, he can be really insightful and helpful towards his fellow patients. And so it's really wonderful seeing this kid just like trying so hard to be good, even though his brain is like basically cooking inside his skull. Also, the audiobook narration for this book was fantastic. I highly recommend it. Because he has a lot of these delusional experiences, there are a lot of characters that he's created, and so the audiobook narrator does these characters really well, and he does a lot of different voices for all the characters, and it's a really expressive narration. You can also hear in Caden's voice when he's starting to go manic, and I just found the whole experience to be really moving in a way that really surprised me. And so this is probably going to be one of those top 5 books of the year books for me. I'm really impressed with this one. So that was everything that I managed to read in November. So we are now in the last month of the year, which means that if I want to finish the Pop Sugar Reading Challenge, I have 3 books left. I'm so happy, because last year I had like 10 books left. So the 3 books that I am going to be reading in December to finish off the challenge are The Devil Wears Prada by Lauren Weisberger. This is for read a book with a protagonist that has the same occupation as you. I do not work as an executive assistant in a fashion magazine, but I am an office assistant, so I'm just calling it close enough. And this is a book that I've kind of wanted to read for a little while, so we're gonna see how that goes. The next book is one that I've been mentioning for a little while. This is Gemina by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. I've started this book. I just didn't get very far into it this month. I only got about there, so we are going to actually have to finish this month. And then the final book is read a book that was the first book that you saw in a bookstore. So I'm reading Jay Asher's What Light because I've read a previous book by his that I really enjoyed, which was 13 Reasons Why. And this one is also just kind of seasonally appropriate because it's about a girl whose family owns a Christmas tree farm. So why not read that in December? So that is actually going to be everything for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned, what you thought of them down in the comments, and I will see you guys very soon with another video. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye. I don't like what I'm seeing lately. Oh, 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 oh. There is no love lost here between us. We are those friends who pull no punches, shot from the hip with one another. We often far from them, we are way back when. I never knew that I could be so down. Okay, what? Okay, let's just start.